Okay, today we're going to start talking about the Watergate scandal and what happened with that. So, Jordan, hopefully you're done flirting with the boys and we can get started here. Hopefully you should have all brought your headphones and you can listen to this individually. So we're going to get started. First, we're going to start with a video.
After Nixon's inauguration, a new wave of demonstrations flared up. To date, 34,000 Americans had been killed in Vietnam, exceeding the total for the Korean War. The cost was running at over $25 billion a year. Unknown to the American public, the Air Force, under the veil of extreme secrecy, had been hammering away at communist bases in Cambodia. On orders from the White House and without knowledge of Congress, B-52s had conducted over 3,600 raids on jungle sanctuaries. Nixon soon made the public announcement that a new phase of the war had begun and that an end to the war was in sight. His credibility, however, had reached an unprecedented low. So great was the public outcry against this new involvement that the Congress resurrected the issue of its right to declare war and passed a resolution demanding the evacuation of all American troops in Cambodia and an end to air support there by July 1970. On campuses, the reactions were so widespread as to eclipse all previous protests. In May of 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio, the most telling event of the anti-war movement occurred. The National Guard was brought in to bring order to a peace demonstration being held on campus that had gotten out of control. The guardsmen fired tear gas cans at the crowd. In the ensuing melee, the National Guardsmen opened fire on the crowd. 13 students were shot, 4 of them fatally. Charges that the student demonstrations were clear-cut cases of communist influence pervaded the Oval Office, and Nixon began to distrust even his most ardent supporters. The president turned to illegal forms of behavior to locate evidence to substantiate his beliefs. The following spring, the New York Times began publishing Pentagon leaks about the military activities in Southeast Asia, and the White House took an increasingly tight-lipped tenor. Even though Nixon had opened relations with Communist China and signed the first strategic arms limitation treaty with the Soviet Union, Nixon's first term in office had been a tumultuous one. But one of the highlights of those years occurred on July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong became the first man to set foot on the moon. John F. Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade had become a reality, as millions of people back home on Earth watched in amazement. President Nixon was re-elected in 1972 by an overwhelming majority. Taking the vote as a mandate, he proceeded to harden his position with the Vietnamese. Massive bombing attacks occurred until, on January 27, 1973, a peace accord was signed by all involved in the conflict. Nixon declared that he had achieved peace with honor, but in reality, the United States had lost their first war in history. During Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign, agents of his re-election committee were caught breaking into Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. The scandal that followed was to bring down Nixon's presidency. Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, and later Leon Jaworski, gathered evidence in the ensuing investigation. During Senate hearings, it was learned that Nixon had secretly taped many of his conversations in the Oval Office. The tapes disclosed that he was involved from the beginning of the break-in and, more importantly, the cover-up. In an unrelated incident, Vice President Spiro T. Agnew was forced to resign in 1973 following an indictment on charges of criminal behavior. To fill the vacancy, Nixon nominated, and Congress approved, House Minority Leader Gerald R. Ford as vice president. Facing impeachment from the House of Representatives, Richard Nixon resigned the presidency on August 9, 1974, something no president has ever done. That same day, Gerald R. Ford was sworn into office as the first president not to have been popularly elected to either the vice presidency or the presidency. Referring to Watergate, Ford declared that our long national nightmare was over and then went on to pardon Nixon for his involvement. Ford served out the remainder of Nixon's term in office, presided over the nation's bicentennial celebration and was nominated for president in 1976. He lost the election to the former Democratic governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter.
Okay, so there's a little background information on Nixon's presidency. Now, this may be a little difficult to see, I know, with the white and black background, but hopefully we'll be able to get all this accomplished. So here come your notes. What happens is that there is a group formed, and from time to time I'm going to pop out of the notes and I'm going to go into Microsoft PowerPoint. And if I type something on Microsoft PowerPoint, you need to write it down in your notes. There was a group form called CRP. Okay? Now for you boys, this does not mean Conservation Reserve Program, a place where there's usually good pheasant hunting. What CRP stands for is Committee for the Re-election of the President. And what happens is that one night at the Watergate complex, the Watergate complex was a brand new complex that had been built in Washington, D.C., and it housed a number of buildings. There was office buildings, there was the Watergate Hotel, and one night the security guard is making the rounds, and as he gets to the Democratic National Headquarters office, he notices that the door is opened up, and he doesn't really think much of it, and he continues on his way. And as he passes by it a second time, he notices that the door is open again, and this time when he investigates a little closer, he sees that a piece of tape has been placed over the latch so that when the door is closed, it looks like it's closed, but it hasn't locked. And so he calls for police, and when they arrive, they go inside, and they find 3 members of the CRP there, and they get arrested. Originally, it is thought that these individuals are just some petty thieves, and they're thinking that a place like the Democratic National Headquarters probably has large sums of money, and they're thinking that that's just what they're looking for. Well, what happens is the Washington Post, the editor, hears of this, and so he sends one of his reporters to the courthouse the next day, and he tells them, hey, there's a break-in at the Democratic National Headquarters. I want you to go down. I want you to find out what's going on. And this reporter, I'm not sure if it was Woodward or Bernstein, but whichever one it was, heads down there. And as the judge is looking at the files on the different individuals, he comes across a man by the name of James McCord, and I'm running the cursor across his name right now. And James McCord is a former CIA agent. So all of a sudden, it strikes this newspaper reporter, what is a person that is a former CIA agent doing breaking into the Democratic National Headquarters? This is no longer just some petty thieves. And as a little more investigation is done, it's determined that not only was James McCord a former CIA agent, he's also associated with the Committee for the Re-election of the President. So Woodward or Bernstein, whichever one it was, goes and gets the other, and they start to do a little more investigation. And as it turns out, what they uncover is something that no one in this country could have imagined up to this point. Now, one thing I'm not going to do is, you see that there are a couple of things up here, Forrest Gump and Watergate. I'm not gonna click on those, but if you want to, you can. Anyway, more investigation is done, and all of a sudden, people start to break. The first one that breaks is James McCord, and James McCord strikes up a deal, and he agrees that he will cooperate as long as the charges against him are reduced greatly. And that deal is struck, so McCord just starts singing like a songbird. And he says that one of the key prosecutors is John Dean. And John Dean says that Nixon had ordered the cover-up. He didn't order the break-in, he ordered the cover-up of the break-in. Because Nixon was afraid that if his name was associated with the break-in, that people are going to think, oh, Nixon wanted to get information on how the Democrats were going to run their election campaign. Having that information would be like if you have two teams, if you had two football teams getting ready to play each other, and one team got the other team's playbook, and now they know exactly what they're going to do as soon as they bark something out. Well, if the Republicans knew what the Democrats were going to base their 1972 election campaign on, then the Republicans could prepare for it. And as soon as the Democrats said, okay, this is what we're going to do, the Republicans could counter by saying, that's not going to work, and here's why. And they would have had time to prepare that argument. And so Nixon was afraid that that would be the case. And so Nixon is now getting drug into this. And when this comes out, Nixon, of course, denies it up one side and down the other. Well, another one of the prosecutors, a guy by the name of Alexander Butterfield. Butterfield remembers that Nixon has had recording equipment installed in the White House. With all of the war protests that was going on and Nixon's popularity fading a little bit, Nixon had come obsessed with wanting to win the 1972 election. And he was afraid that people within the White House, people within his own circle, were unfaithful, unloyal to him. So he had recording equipment placed all throughout the White House. So that way, if people were carrying on a conversation and talking about their disloyalty to Nixon, he could hear it. The thing is, Nixon himself forgot that he had the recording equipment in the White House. Alexander Butterfield did not. And so Butterfield says, well, I know how we can find out if Nixon ordered the cover-up. Let's listen to the tapes. Nixon then realizes what he has said about ordering the cover-up is on the tapes. And he knows that his goose is cooked, or since we just got done with Thanksgiving and Christmas is around the corner, his turkey's cooked. So anyway, Nixon says, nope, I'm not going to turn over the tapes. And Congress is demanding that he turns them over. And he says, no, I'm not going to turn them over, and here's why. I'm going to exercise my executive privilege. I'm the president. I don't have to turn them over. Not only that, there is also information on those tapes that could jeopardize the security of this nation. And I'm not going to be the one responsible for our nation's security being jeopardized simply because you want to see some tapes. So what ends up happening is the Supreme Court gets involved. Well, while the Supreme Court is getting involved, it comes out that Spiro Agnew, while he was vice president of Maryland, has accepted bribes, and Agnew is impeached. So Nixon has to nominate someone to take Agnew's place, and he nominates Gerald Ford. Now at this point, I'm going to stop this recording because I can only go for 15 minutes, and I'm at 14 minutes and 30 seconds. So there's another recording, and all you have to do is go on to that one to finish up these notes.